A California Residential Purchase Agreement, known as an RPA for short, is a legal contract between the buyer and the seller of a home. It outlines all of the terms and conditions of the transaction, including the purchase price, financing options, down payment, escrow, and more. In this video, we'll cover how a residential purchase agreement works, the legal requirements in California, whether a buyer or seller can back out of a purchase agreement, and what to include. We're eForms, the biggest online database for legal documents. Stick around and we'll tell you where you can find an official residential purchase agreement specific to California. First, let's review. How does a residential purchase agreement exactly work? A residential purchase agreement acts as an official offer from a prospective buyer to the seller of a house. In addition to outlining all of its terms of the transaction, the document also details conditions that must be met for the agreement to stay in effect. The seller, once they've reviewed the agreement, can either accept, reject, or make a counteroffer. This brings us to the next topic, the legal requirements in California. California has one of the strictest set of laws governing property disclosure that the seller must make to the buyer. There are around 10 required disclosures in total, and if the seller does not provide them before the agreement is finalized, the buyer has 3 to 5 days to terminate the offer. The required disclosures include proximity to a natural hazard, information about sex offenders in the area, real estate taxes, water heater and smoke detector compliance, wood destroying pest inspection, and more. In addition, under federal law, the seller must disclose the property's history of lead-based paint exposure if it was built before 1978. After the contract is signed, the buyer or seller may change their mind about the transaction. Can a buyer or seller back out of a purchase agreement? The answer is yes, and there are several cases that allow it in California. Contingencies are not met. Contingencies are written into the agreement outlining what conditions must be satisfied by either party for the contract to stay valid. This could range from the buyer obtaining financing to the seller providing property repairs. If any contingency is not met, the buyer typically has around 10 days to terminate the contract. If the seller wants to cancel as a result of the buyer failing to act in accordance with the contract, they may fill out a document called a notice to buyer to perform or a notice to close escrow. They have the right to issue a cancellation 2 or 3 days after the document is delivered. Contingencies are met, but the buyer still wants to terminate the agreement. In this case, the termination becomes a little more complicated. The buyer can still back out of the contract even after contingencies have been met, but if it's without any legal reason, the seller may be able to keep the buyer's earnest money deposit. Under California law, both escrow cancellations, instructions, and a cancellation of the purchase contract must be signed by both the buyer and the seller for the contract to be effectively terminated. Exactly what should be included in your residential purchase agreement to better your chances of getting accepted by the seller? Include a mortgage pre-approval letter. A mortgage pre-approval letter is a document from the bank estimating how much it is willing to lend to the buyer based on their credit history, income, debts, and assets. This helps the seller determine whether the buyer is financially credible. Offer an earnest money deposit. An earnest money deposit is a percentage of the offer and provided to the seller as a show of good faith. It is written into the residential purchase agreement and typically delivered when the agreement is signed. Use an addendum to modify or add to the agreement. An addendum is often included with a residential purchase agreement to add to or amend any terms and conditions. It can also detail a contingency which allows either party to opt out of the contract if certain terms are not met. If you're in need of an official California residential agreement, you can get started by clicking the link right here. Hit that subscribe button as well for more videos that help you simplify the legal process for everything ranging from buying or selling a house to making a will and more.